All good?
Yeah.
Thumbs up. Perfect. Well, thanks for inviting me to the Lewis Climate Hub forum. It's really exciting to be here, and really interesting talk from Rena. It's fascinating to hear her take on the rewilding process, and hopefully some of the things that I'll talk about will kind of chime in with that. I'm a consultant, I'm an ecologist. The thing I'm really interested in is how people can engage with the rewilding process, and how can we get communities in particular kind of pull together and this really exciting initiative that's clearly kind of grabbing lots of people's attention, and for good reason. So in my talk, I wanted to kind of cover a number of themes, just touch on what is rewilding from my perspective, why is it important, what are the role of people and communities in rewilding, and just some simple ideas about how we could rewild, how all of us could actually be involved in the rewilding process, no matter how small the area of land we have available to us, window box upwards. So let's go through and talk about some of those things. So there are lots of different definitions of rewilding actually when you search around the internet. So not to be outdone, I thought I'd invent my own. So this is one sort of simple version of it that I hope kind of encapsulates it for you. So rewilding is a form of nature conservation that recognises that wildlife can look after itself if we restore the native species that used to roam our countryside. So I think what we're starting to realise is just how important those lost native species were. And the question is, well, why were they so important? What difference did they really make? And as Rena's touched on her talk, it's really the fact that these animals were engineers. And that is a word that we are all very familiar with, of course, because there are few better engineers than human beings. We've engineered entire cities and cityscapes, building them from the ground to incredible heights. So we understand about engineering, but what we're increasingly understanding is the engineering capabilities of some of the animals that used to and still live around us. And so let's have a look at a couple of obvious examples of those. So here's one we've touched on already. Beavers. Beavers create these incredible dams, these structures, which are not just good for them, but they're actually engineering the landscape. They are reducing the risk of flooding, but also creating these incredible wetland areas, these ponds and lakes and wetland habitats that are just so important for so many other animals, for fishes, for invertebrates, for amphibians, for birds. So they're creating habitats themselves. They are ecosystem engineers. Let's take a look at another one that we don't have in the UK right now, but we did once, the wolf. We know from studies of Yellowstone National Park, which I would thoroughly recommend you look at if you haven't already, that wolves re-engineered the ecosystem when they were reintroduced. They actually allowed saplings and trees to regenerate along river systems. Why? Because deer, who were overpopulating the area, felt more nervous in those areas. They felt the wolves could attack them. They were vulnerable in those spots. So when the wolves returned, the deer population reduced in those areas and allowed it to regenerate, created new habitat. So wolves are ecosystem engineers. And as previously discussed, we have these large herbivores that used to roam across the British Isles in far larger numbers and diversity than they do today. And of course, they browse and graze the landscape, they reduce tree cover, they create open spaces and mosaics, and they are engineering the environment and the landscape around them. So they're creating these niches and these habitats for lots of other plants and animals and fungi to proliferate and enjoy. And we've lost so many of these. I would really recommend that you have a look at Rewilding Europe's wonderful illustrations, which you can find online. I've just put a bit of a montage of these together here. They're absolutely fantastic. You can see here the beaver, the bison, the wolf, and the wild horse. And what's lovely about them is they show the impact of these ecosystem engineers, how they bring other animals into play and provide niches, feeding and breeding niches for all of these other animals just by existing in the landscape. And that's something that wildlife conservationists are really coming around to understanding, the real benefits of these animals, many of which we've lost. But I do have one slight issue with these fantastic illustrations. There's one species, there's one animal that I don't see in any of these illustrations, and I find that a little bit frustrating. And that species is, of course, us, human beings. Where do we fit with this whole concept of rewilding? How integral should we be to it? Are we to be on the inside at the very center of it? Should we be on the outside looking in and gazing in at these incredible wild parks? What is the future? And I have a very firm belief that human beings, modern human beings, the populations that we have now, we have to be at the center of this process. We absolutely need to be engaging with and back on our landscape. And that means we need to understand rewilding and be part of it. What's the evidence for that? Well, one thing we do know is that human beings have been roaming the British landscape for almost 1 million years. That is a long time to be integrating into the ecosystem. Yes, we've been thrown off a few times, a few glaciations have occurred, and we found it a bit cold, and along with most of the other mammals, we've been chucked out, but we came back. And we've been very much integral to that landscape. In fact, there were several species of humans roaming the landscape. That's something to contemplate. And the latest modern humans, look at your partner or look at someone else in the room at this moment, appeared in the British Isles around about 40,000 years ago. So very, very recently. If you think about that, almost 1 million years of inhabitancy of these islands from human beings. And I would wager that when we arrived, we probably actually enhanced the landscape. I think there's a very good chance that we increased biodiversity. We were just one other animal that integrated and changed and evolved and moved the landscape around. And like other top predators, we would have been hunting and fishing and moved animals through that hunting dance that takes place between predators and herbivores. We also would have been foraging for fruit and nuts and redistributing seeds across the landscape and adding to the ecosystem in that way. We would have been lighting fires, most probably, which also is good for things like dead wood and certain fungi that thrive on these kind of ashes from fires. So all these things add diversity to the landscape. But somewhere along the way, something started to go wrong. We maybe got a bit greedy. We started overhunting certain species. And we know from the historical record, the archaeological record and beyond, that we started to lose some of these species. But it's not that long ago. I mean, we had straight-tusked elephants in the British Isles until 120,000 years ago. Woolly mammoths just 11,000 years ago when we lost them. An Irish elk with its huge antlers we lost from the British Isles just 8,000 years ago. Really not long in terms of ecosystems. And then just 7,000 years ago, a whole new wave of human beings came across to the British Isles, and they brought with them agriculture. I mean, 1 million years of human beings, just 7,000 years of agriculture. It's tiny, isn't it? But now we have a whole different reason for being. Now we have something to protect. Our desire now is to keep certain animals and plants out of our environment and to protect our crops and protect our animals. And as a result of that, we see further extinctions. The auroch, the wild cattle, extinct 3,500 years ago. Lynx, 1,550 years ago. Brown bear, 1,200 years ago. There are oak trees alive today that probably had a brown bear scratching itself underneath them. Imagine that. Wild boar just 450 years ago, and wolf 260 years ago. So these were major predators and herbivores that were roaming our landscape and having a massive impact on our ecosystems. And slowly but surely, they have declined. But I would also argue that there is another species that, whilst you certainly couldn't say it's extinct, I would argue that it's come close to extinction across the British landscape. And guess who it is? It's back to us. It's the human beings again. You know, something terrible happened 270 years ago. It was called the Enclosures Act, a series of acts that lasted over 100 years. And those acts meant that the common person who owned small amounts of land across the United Kingdom and Ireland were thrown off those pieces of land, and larger farms and landowners own more land, but there were fewer of us that actually owned land. And we still suffer the consequences of that today. I mean, this is an absolutely shocking statistic. Half of the entirety of England is owned by 1% of its population. The other half, there are 55 million of us squeezed into it. So to put it another way, roughly the population of Haywards Heath owns half of England. Not literally, I don't want you to worry too much about the people of Haywards Heath, good people, there they are. But it's incredible how we've also found ourselves not able to roam the land that we used to be able to roam, just like many of these animals that have become extinct. And that is a real problem in terms of our opportunities to connect with nature. So I thought I would have a go at sort of re-envisioning the concept of rewilding from a community perspective, from a perspective of how people engage with nature. Because I think that this rewilding revolution, if you like, is so exciting. But alongside it, we really need to think much more carefully about our place within this rewilding, because if we're going to save the planet, we need to think about how we're going to rewild ourselves and how we're going to get communities and people engaged with nature through rewilding. This cannot just be something for those people who own large pieces of land. So this is my attempt anyway. So community rewilding is a form of nature conservation that empowers communities to actively participate as engineers of rich, biodiverse ecosystems. If other animals can be the engineers, surely we can as well. Rewilding communities restore native species and replicate natural processes for social, economic, and environmental benefit. And they break down barriers associated with exclusive land ownership, focusing instead on land sharing, land access, and land stewardship. So that's a bit of my take on where we need to go, how we need to combine our increased access with the land, with engaging personally with the rewilding process. But what about now? What about our homes and our gardens and our rooftops and our windowsills? What can we do with the little pieces of land that we do, most of us have available to us? Well, it's a good place to start. And I guess the first obvious thing is to let nature into your land if you can. There are other simple things to do. Letting your lawn go for a few weeks in the summer unmown is a wonderful way of seeing flowers come up and bees feeding on the nectar. Planting a tree if you have space, or a hedge. Digging a pond, my personal favourite, digging a pond, even in the smallest of urban spaces, allows wildlife to proliferate. And I think all that stuff is a really important first step that we should all make. What I would say, though, is that for me, that is not rewilding. That is wildlife gardening, which is great. But I think we can go further. I think that's what's so exciting about rewilding, is that even in small spaces, how can we actually replicate these processes? Admittedly, can't put an enormous great red deer stag in the back of your average person's garden. Although if we start to rewild it, maybe we'll find one there one morning, which is even more exciting. But what can we do? Well, let's have a look at some of those opportunities to replicate these wild processes. We know that one thing that beavers do is to coppice trees, something that people have done through the generations. And British trees, many species, actually respond incredibly well to coppicing because they're so used to it happening to them. They have to evolve and adapt to it. And when they regenerate, it creates loads of new young shoots coming through. It's fantastic for insects, great for nesting birds. So coppicing is actually replicating a beaver or another, or an elephant, a long-tusked elephant. They also used to rip trees apart, just like they do in Africa today. What else can we do more of? Pruning. I mean, herbivores browsing. What's the difference between that and human beings pruning their fruit trees, for example? Why do we do it? We do it for a good reason. It regenerates the tree. It creates more flowers, creates more fruit. That's great for wildlife. We're replicating those natural processes. What about this one? Coming up for February, I think it's National Nest Box Day is coming up, or it's maybe even this weekend. We could make normal nest boxes like we have for generations, or we could build our very own white stork nest, which you can see on the right-hand side here. Fantastic that white storks are coming back to the UK. It's going to take a long time before they're everywhere, so why don't we give them a helping hand? If you go to my website, I can show you how to do this. It's super simple. But why would you? Well, these are ecosystems in their own right. They can be up to a ton in weight. They make fantastic refuges for overwintering butterflies and insects. They are very, very important nest sites, not just for storks, but for house sparrows and tree sparrows, which have declined catastrophically across the UK. So there are other ways that we can replicate our wilder inhabitants and still create these amazing habitats in our own homes and gardens. Here's a really controversial one for you. So everyone's seen their cats scratching to sharpen their claws. Well, bears, particularly in springtime, we used to have brown bears in this country, they typically will scratch younger trees, damage them, because they're trying to get to the cambium beneath, which is sweet in the springtime. That's nutritious. So they'll scratch the trees and they'll have a bit of a chew and a bit of a gnaw in there. And that damages those trees. But actually, it's creating a niche. It's creating a niche for deadwood saprophytic beetles and invertebrates. As these trees get older, that weakness actually forms holes, which are important for nesting, for roosting bats and for birds. So you could use, for example, a hand rake is very, very similar to a bear's claws, and do a little bit of tree damage and replicate what our ecosystems used to be like when we had brown bears. Now, it's very controversial and you might want to do that. The point I'm trying to make is we could have a lot of fun in small spaces thinking about how these animals used to behave. And I'd love to hear your own ideas. This is just about being creative. And the more creative we are, and the more kind of diversity we create in our own environments, the better it is for our wildlife. It's really as simple as that. We talked earlier about grazers. This is where it gets really fun. You're going to have to knock on your neighbour's door now, because I mean, if you've only got a back lawn, you can't put a horse or a deer on it. But what about if you borrowed the neighbour's chickens, got a few rabbits in every so often, see if you could borrow a guinea pig from your niece? I mean, what would happen? All of these animals graze at different levels. They choose different plants, just like those big herbivores. Maybe even at small sites, we could actually increase biodiversity and have a lot of fun doing it. And I think it's easy with our homes and our gardens to think we can't have a big impact, but of course we really can. There are 10 million acres of gardens across Britain. That is absolutely huge. In fact, there's more acreage of gardens in our country than there is all of the nature reserves put together. So yes, we can do small things in our little environment and make a big difference. But to do so, we need a helping hand, and especially if we are to come together as communities, as individuals. The number one question I get from people is, I want to do rewilding. How can I do it? Who can I connect with? And here I'd really like to point you towards the Rewilding Britain charity and the website that they run, which is excellent. They've got some very exciting initiatives coming up, and one of the biggest ones is the Rewilding Network. And a big part of that will be providing opportunities for individuals in communities to connect with each other through an online forum. The Rewilding Britain team are going to start providing supporting information and advice to be able to support that process. So there are already communities around the UK who are gathering together to start community rewilding projects, but it's in its infancy. But I really think the Rewilding Network is going to help to sort of accelerate that process. And hopefully those of us who want to do this stuff can connect and really get the ball rolling. And I think it's also really important to look at kind of some of the initiatives that are out there already. This is a wonderful one, in my opinion. This is Street Goat, which is a community initiative running in Bristol, where they're moving their ownership of goats, and they're moving those goats around different urban landscapes, regenerating the vegetation, providing food for local people as well through milk and cheese from the goats, and just what a wonderful thing to be able to walk through an urban environment and see semi-wild goats as part of your landscape. And through community rewilding, I think we can do more of these things. We can be sharing animals, we can be working together, and I think we can play a really major role in this process. But I think one of the biggest challenges is over land. I think we found that in our discussions in Lewis, for example, over the last 12 months. But we've got to face it head on as a community, and we've got to look at all of the land that we have available collectively. And we need to look at common land, which is something that we still do have access and ownership of as the people of this country. We need to look at areas of wasteland. We need to look at council-owned land. Some of this land the council can barely afford to manage themselves anymore and may welcome the help. We need to engage more with private landowners and work with them and encourage them to not only think about rewilding, but think about how communities can be a bigger part of land management. And then we need to look at land purchase. And I think there'll be more money available for land purchase, but we're the community. We can also crowdfund and get more land back into our common ownership so that we can do some really exciting things with it for people and for nature. And I'd like to finish off just by saying that this is just such a wonderful time. I mean, it's a scary time in terms of the climate crisis and the loss of biodiversity, but you know, when our back's against the walls, that's when the really exciting stuff happens. And to think that there are already these incredible rewilding initiatives happening, you know, we have a bison rewilding project in Kent that's begun. We have obviously beavers rewilding all over the country now. The net project with white storks is really exciting. We've got white-tailed seagulls returning to the Isle of Wight project there. You know, there are so many great projects taking place, but it's essential, I think, that we think a lot more about how people can be at the very, very heart of this rewilding initiative. And with you guys on board and many others, that's the future. So thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Do have a look at my website, wilderlife.org, and you can find me on Twitter as well, rewilding_gardener, and I'll happily take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. Fantastic. Okay, so we've got a few questions lined up already. First of all, Dinah, you wanted to ask about small mixed farms.
Yeah, hello, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, you know, taking into account that all these creatures kind of co-create the environment and co-engineer it, the role of small mixed farms, which seem to be what indigenous farmers all over the world have traditionally managed to live quite happily most of the time with the local fauna, is that something that would be beneficial in our landscape in the UK?
Yeah, I think it does. You know, anything, you know, the rotation systems and really, I think what we see from indigenous communities, which is so smart, is these communities are working so closely with nature, and they have such a profound understanding of nature that they're working within the framework of how nature works, really. So they might create, you know, an open space, chop down some rainforest, for example, but then that space is allowed to regenerate. And we can see with the mosaics of habitat that we've talked about with these other herbivores, that's very much in sync with the way that the environment should be working. So I think any kind of system that allows us to maintain that variability, that diversity really, and that variability is taking us back closer to something that works for nature. You know, it is really important to bear in mind, I think, that whilst you know, we've lost so many of these species over the last, you know, hundreds or thousands of years, but we did retain a lot of our nature over that time, and that's because people were effectively replicating those ecosystems. You know, we were farming at a much smaller scale. We were coppicing and regenerating our woodland habitats. And so our nature was able to hold on and even thrive in those ecosystems. I think it's really, really important to note that the paper came out in 2019, which was looking at a huge number of big ecosystems, mostly tropical ecosystems. And it found that where there were indigenous communities, the biodiversity was actually higher than where there were no people and there were natural parks. So what we can see from that, if you're happy with that interpretation in the science, is that where people work closely with nature, we can actually achieve a higher level of biodiversity than we can when people are on the outside looking in. And that's why we really, really need to have that interaction, and we need to play around with those opportunities.
Okay.
So yes, they can work.
Thanks, Dylan. Charlie, did you want to pose your question about rewilding ourselves?
Hi, yeah. So you mentioned rewilding ourselves. I don't know if you meant at an individual level or community level, but I'm my big thing is thinking of ways to rewild myself as an individual, my worldview really. But I just wondered what you meant by that, if you've got any ideas.
Yeah, and I think it's all of those things, and it's going to be different things for different people. But essentially, I think probably everyone on this call would acknowledge that we have lost our connection with nature in many, many different ways. When we go to the supermarket, for example, and we've got to get that back. We've got to get back to being local, and we've got to get back to understanding what nature is. There's some really interesting research in the US, which was done quite a long time ago, and it showed that those people who hunted for food, even just from a social perspective, had as good an understanding of ecosystems as conservationists. And that's because they had a really good understanding of what natural ecosystems were, because they were out there hunting in them. So I think that's what we've lost. And there are a million different ways of finding ways to reconnect with nature, but we've got to encourage people to get out there. And I think this rewilding is a fabulous, fabulous kind of hook that we can use to get people back in our wild places again and actively involved.
I think that's so interesting, because you're actually implying a definition that is more about eco-literacy and understanding how things work, rather than just being in nature to connect. It's much more about learning how it works. And yeah, if you're a hunter or a fisherman, like my brother knows more about the river than I do because he fishes. That's such a good point. Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
No, I just to pick up on that, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. I don't think, there are many of us who don't spend time walking across the South Downs, but there's probably most of the people on this call do. But even that's probably not enough to really connect and understand how these ecosystems work. We've got to get our hands dirty again, and we've got to encourage our kids to really get stuck in there. But that's not a bad thing. It's exciting, it's fun. Let's get in there and start experimenting. And I think that's what's great about rewilding, is none of us really know the true consequences of what happens when you either replicate these systems or you bring these animals onto the systems. That's what's so kind of firing everyone's imagination. But let's not have our imagination fired by watching it on television. Let's all get out there and actually do it.
Thank you. Brilliant. Very inspiring.
Okay, last question for this session, I think. Jo, you wanted to mention guerrilla gardening?
I did. Thank you so much, Dylan, for the talk. It was fantastic. Yeah, well, how do you feel about guerrilla gardening if it's done with wisdom? Because I think, there's so much land being owned by landowners that maybe we need to be a little bit more stealth with things too.
Yeah, that's a tough question, isn't it? I think for me, it's more about how we give back to nature. We touched on hunting, and I think foraging is another really great way of connecting and starting to understand our landscape more. So everyone goes out and picks blackberries, I hope, but there's the country's full of all these amazing things that we can go out and eat. But the first thing people will worry about will be, oh, if we all do that, there's not going to be anything left. Well, not so if we do it in the right way. If we forage for things but think, well, hang on, for everything I pick, I need to ensure that 2 new plants grow up in another location. How can I take a cutting? How can I make sure I replant some of these seeds and nuts? How can I be part of the ecosystem like these other animals? Then I think we can, so it's not quite answering the sort of guerrilla gardening question, but what I think we can start to do is, it could be more innate in the way that we think about our role in a landscape as giving back to wildlife. Rather than just going on a walk, why don't we go on a walk where we plant 3 oak acorns? What harm can that possibly do? Worst thing is I'll feed a wood mouse or something. So maybe we can think more about how we do engage the landscape in a way that isn't going to offend anybody who owns land.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Fantastic. We're going to move on now to our last speaker,